It's inspiring and a privilege to be here today with so many activists who have been struggling with this prison crisis for so long. We've had 10 years or so now since this movement has sort of emerged as a movement, and this is a classic Dickensian moment. It is the best of times and the worst of times. We have a situation in our actual prisons that is simply must be described as what it is, which is a human rights crime, easily as great and probably a magnitude greater than Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib when you think about the sheer numbers of people now being subjected to what is essentially been found to be by our own courts a constitutionally violative situation, a human rights crisis of the highest portions. On the other hand, at least in comparison with the 20-some years that I've been trying to observe the California prison system, I don't think we've ever been closer to the possibility of breaking through some of its fundamental logics that have been driving things for so long in the state. It's hard to believe, you know, with the recent figure that I gather Angela Davis spoke about today of the 101 of 100 Americans now behind bars, that it was only 20 or so years ago that it was around, or 30 I should say, that it was around 1,000, 1 in 1,000 in prison, which by global standards was high at the time, but staggeringly different from where we are now. So keep that in mind. That seems like a long time to most of the students in the room, but to many of us, you know, I was just starting college here in the Bay Area at that time when where it was more like 1 out of 1,000 Californians in prison rather than 1 of 100. What I want to talk about today is what I hope can help in trying to think about keeping the struggle effective at a time when we aren't going to have a roadmap to follow, when we have to keep reminding ourselves what it is we're struggling against. And what I want to suggest to you as what I hope will be a helpful metaphor or frame is to focus on the war on crime. I want to suggest to you that we have a prison crisis, to be sure, but it's not really a crisis of prison culture, nor does it have a penological solution. I don't think that changing the name of the California Department of Corrections to the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation is going to change things. I don't think even implementing a serious rehabilitative program, whatever that would mean on the scale of a system we're talking about, is really going to change things. And indeed, as much as I admire the goal of reducing the scale of the prison system, I'm not even sure that were we to enter a brave new world of high-tech surveillance and control systems in which very few people were in, quote, prisons, and many more were in, you know, re-entry centers and halfway houses or simply in electronic ghettos of one sort or another, would be a world that we really want to struggle for. As an alternative to the prison as the focus of our struggle, I want to suggest to you for a moment that the war on crime itself is the enemy here that we need to overcome, and that if we're going to end the California prison crisis, we're going to need to do that by ending the war on crime. And I'll come back in a moment to what it would mean to end the war on crime. But let's remind ourselves that, you know, we talk a lot about war on poverty, war on cancer, an idea I want to come back to, obviously war on terror. I'm a firm believer that war on crime needs more of our attention because it's never really gone away. It was much bigger than the war on poverty ever imagined itself to be, much bigger than the war on cancer ever became. And what we call the war on terror, I would suggest to you, is in many ways simply an extension of, an elaboration of, a continuation of this war on crime that really gets going in the pivotal year of 1968. You can find earlier roots of it, to be sure, but it's that year whose anniversary, 40th anniversary, frighteningly for some of us, we celebrate this year. A year when, in ways that are too complex for us to break down today, but we can continue to talk about, everything from police riots in Chicago to assassinations to civil disorders in major cities all over the country got gridded as a problem of violence as crime and law and order as the words came to be known in those days. Now I want to suggest to you that we think of this as far more than just a political electoral agenda. It has been a way of making stranger danger the value that Americans bring to government, to politics, to civil society in a way that distorts and haunts all of our opportunities to address real crime, but also many of the major social problems we face. It's been promoted and articulated and opportunistically used, to be frank, by politicians of both parties. Do not assume that this is a Republican Party platform. Do not think that even somebody as great as Barack Obama is going to lead us out of this. And I think he might be the right leader to respond to an upwelling of American demand that we move away from this war. But no major politician in either party then or now is going to lead us out of this. I mean, you know Dianne Feinstein, that's Tom Feeney, who's an equally reprehensible crime warrior on the other side of the partisan divide. But it's also us. Nothing happens real in this country that only stays in the political class. The war on crime has come to be a very productive framework for all of us in some ways. And in that way, we might think of it as like the Cold War, although it's not an exact comparison. But yes, the Cold War was a vehicle for racism. It was also a vehicle in which the NAACP was able to effectively push the federal government to support desegregation of schools, a problematic, imperfect victory to be sure. But likewise, the war on crime is one that has offered us all kinds of civil society opportunities to imagine ourselves as victims, to frame our problems as victim problems, and to seek redress from government in the name of victims. Let me bring this home to California, where for 30-some years now, we've had our political system anchored in very much this war on crime model of what government can do for us. I think the man who really gets primary credit for the California version of this is the one who never wanted to be president, Duke Majan. And perhaps because he never wanted to be president, he was wonderfully blunt about what he was up to. So he laid it out in his final State of the State address in 1989 when he said California had just 12 prisons when he started. He built 14 new ones. And his goal really was, he puts it perfectly here, was to move 52,000, now think about 100,000 people from the community to prisons. That was the project. I mean, there was no apology here. There's no trying to deceive anyone here. It's right on the surface. It's very clear. The man who did want to be president continued this and brought out, this is a nice quote because it reminds us how deeply racist the whole series of ideas that circulate in the war on crime are, although it would be a mistake to view it as anchored in that as a motivation. If you don't see how many unracist people can be pulled into, co-opted by, become participants in the war on crime, including people of color, then you haven't looked hard enough at American society. As I said, it's not a Republican problem. Remember this man, whose despicable viewpoints on crime I like to remind myself of whenever I feel sorry for him, which is not very often. He was replaced by somebody who claimed to be, beyond party altogether, and in some ways credibly is. And is an interesting moment because he is simultaneously, and it's fascinating to watch him do this, articulating the logic of the war on crime in every breath he takes as he continues to promise us that he will always view us as victims and never confront us with any real trade-offs of adult-like life. But at the same time tells us that our prisons are in crisis, that we ought to do something about our warehouse prisons, that we ought not to just recycle people. You all know this chart too well. I like it in its beginning point because that's the year I got to California. I like to remind, I'm not the causal force, I don't think, that started this off, but it is staggering to see how much has changed. What we have now, as I said, is not a crisis of prison culture. What you see in front of you is not a picture of prison culture. It is a picture of a war machine, the war on crime, that has produced warehouse prisons that are really unlike prisons that we've had in this country. I mean, you can find elements of this kind of prison in the history of the prison, but it is not, I mean, prisons have been much different things at different times in our history, and this is something much more like a camp, I mean, in the sense of a displaced persons camp. I mean, God forbid it's not a death camp yet, but with the disease factors that circulate around these kinds of meaningless accumulations of people without any effort to do anything, harness them, there really are death traps that are emerging.